What happens when you finally stop waiting? Jung insight. There's a specific kind of evening that tends to trigger this realization. You're not in crisis. Nothing dramatic just happened. You're just sitting somewhere ordinary, your car in a parking lot, your kitchen after everyone's gone to bed, and you notice you've stopped checking your phone for a reply that was never coming. You're not devastated about it. You're just done waiting. And in that small, undramatic moment, something quietly enormous happens. You start seeing people, and yourself, with a clarity that feels almost unfair. This moment usually doesn't arrive during a breakup, a failure, or even outright loneliness. It tends to arrive afterward, once you've stopped checking who noticed your silence, stopped imagining someone would finally understand your exhaustion, stopped believing that one day someone would show up and carry part of your psychological weight for you. Carl Jung once wrote that one of the most painful experiences a person can have is confronting their own shadow. What gets missed is that the shadow doesn't only hold rage, envy, or violence. Sometimes what's hiding in there is quieter and more embarrassing: abandonment. The realization that some part of you, even now, was still waiting to be rescued by friends, by love, by family, by recognition, by success, by someone. The invisible contract. A lot of people build their personality around this unspoken expectation. They become agreeable because they hope kindness will eventually be repaid. They become useful because usefulness buys a temporary kind of importance. But the world has a brutal way of exposing these unconscious contracts. You help people through their worst moments, then watch them vanish the second they're better. You stay loyal through someone else's chaos, only to realize the loyalty was never returned. You listen to everyone's pain for years, and the one day you finally speak, the room goes strangely quiet. That silence teaches you something most people spend their whole lives avoiding. Attention is not love. Need is not loyalty. Closeness is not commitment. The disturbing part isn't that people leave, it's how normal that is. Jung believed the persona, the social mask, is necessary for survival. Everyone wears one. The supportive friend, the loyal partner, the protector, the empath. But pressure reveals the gap between identity and performance. When you suffer long enough, the masks on the people around you start slipping, not because they're villains, but because most human connection is conditional underneath the surface. Some people only love the version of you that's convenient for their own self-image. The moment you become difficult, tired, or simply unpredictable, their energy shifts, not always loudly. Sometimes it's microscopic, slower replies, a little less warmth, a strange absence in exactly the moments you needed presence most. This is where the real psychological fracture begins. Because the child inside most adults still believes that enough effort creates permanence. It doesn't. People rarely resent your weakness. They resent the possibility that you might outgrow them, and that realization alone has quietly ended entire friendships. The darker truth is that a lot of relationships survive not because of love, but because both people have unconsciously agreed to stay psychologically familiar to one another. The moment one person evolves, that unspoken contract breaks, and the support disappears quietly, like a door closing in another room. At first you rationalize it. They're busy, they're stressed, maybe you're overthinking it. But the mind notices patterns long before the ego is ready to accept them. Kindness without limits quietly teaches people how to use you, and most don't see it until exhaustion forces awareness on them, because the mind is desperate to protect a comforting illusion that if you love deeply enough and stay patient enough, somebody will eventually do the same for you. The architecture of human behavior. Psychology doesn't work that way. People aren't naturally loyal to suffering, they're naturally drawn toward emotional benefit. That sentence sounds cold until you watch reality without sentimentality. Watch what happens when someone loses status. Watch how fast attention disappears once usefulness fades. Even empathy comes with conditions more often than people admit. Most enjoy feeling compassionate. Very few enjoy carrying someone else's darkness for long. That realization quietly transforms certain people. They stop asking for help not because they got stronger, but because they finally understood how human behavior is actually built. The world praises independence, partly because dependent people are inconvenient. That's why so many emotionally wounded people become unusually capable. They learn to solve everything alone, because experience taught them vulnerability creates exposure. So they adapt, calm, self-reliant, composed. But underneath that composure often sits a deeper wound. The grief of realizing nobody was truly coming. Not with unconditional understanding, not with permanent loyalty, not with the rescue fantasy they'd quietly carried since childhood. Jung understood something unsettling about this stage. When illusions die, identity often starts to collapse with them, because a lot of people don't actually know who they are outside the roles they perform: the caretaker, the achiever, the helper, the funny one. Take away the audience, and the personality starts to tremble. That's part of why solitude feels unbearable for so many. Silence strips the performance away. There's nothing to react to, no validation loop, no emotional mirror confirming who you are, just you. Most people have spent their entire lives avoiding direct contact with themselves, staying distracted through constant noise, constant relationships, constant scrolling, anything that drowns out the quieter voice underneath it all, asking the uncomfortable questions. If nobody saved you, why are you still waiting? If people only know your mask, who are you beneath it? Most relationships don't end when respect disappears. They end when awareness shows up, and awareness is expensive, because once you see human nature clearly, you can't keep participating innocently in certain illusions. You start noticing how often people speak emotionally but act strategically, how often affection is quietly tied to control. You begin to understand that a lot of social bonds are held together less by truth and more by mutual psychological comfort. This is usually the stage where a person becomes, in a sense, dangerous to the social world around them, not violent, just aware. You stop over-explaining yourself. You stop begging to be understood. You stop trying to force emotional reciprocity out of people who simply aren't capable of giving it. Something colder starts forming inside you, not hatred, more like distance, because once you accept that nobody is truly coming, another realization trails behind it like a shadow. Most of your suffering came from expectation. The expectation that people would think like you, care like you, sacrifice like you. But human beings interpret relationships through self-interest far more than they like to admit. Some people love you because you make them feel important. Some because you make them feel safe. Very few love without some degree of unconscious extraction, and that truth unsettles people because it threatens the fantasy of pure, uncomplicated connection. Look closely enough, and you'll notice a lot of people panic when you stop needing them emotionally, because your dependence used to give them reassurance. The moment you genuinely detach, people who ignored you start paying attention again, because human psychology tends to value whatever feels uncertain. That's part of why emotionally unavailable people often attract intense attachment, why absence increases obsession. The mind chases what it can't fully secure. When you start seeing the game, once you notice that pattern, social interactions start looking different, almost theatrical. You notice how many conversations are quiet negotiations for power, validation, attention, or control. You notice how guilt gets used as manipulation, dressed up as vulnerability, how praise can function as influence. Jung believed that until the unconscious becomes conscious, it will direct your life, and you'll call the result fate. Most people never make their unconscious conscious, so they repeat the same relational cycles forever, trusting too quickly, confusing attention with sincerity, chemistry with compatibility, being desired with being valued. Someone abandoned emotionally as a child may spend their entire adult life unconsciously trying to earn permanence from people who are emotionally unavailable by definition. The unconscious keeps trying to recreate unresolved pain until awareness interrupts the cycle, and awareness is brutal, because eventually you realize that some of your deepest attachments were never really love. They were attempts to repair old psychological fractures through someone else. That realization can hollow a person out for a while, especially once you understand how much energy you spent trying to become worthy of care that should have existed naturally. The child inside you believed that if you became good enough, useful enough, patient enough, someone would finally stay. But adulthood reveals a colder truth. People stay when staying benefits their own psychology, and the moment it no longer does, plenty slowly disappear while pretending nothing changed. Not everyone, but enough that it permanently changes how you see human nature. After that, you become quieter, not because you have nothing to say, but because you finally understand how rarely people listen without filtering your words through their own needs and projections. Most conversations aren't really exchanges, they're collisions between identities. One person talks to feel understood, the other listens to protect their own self-image. Once you notice that, loneliness changes shape. It stops feeling like the absence of people and starts feeling like the absence of genuine recognition. You can sit in a packed room and still feel psychologically invisible, and plenty of people around you feel exactly the same way while pretending otherwise. That's part of why modern life can feel hollow despite being constantly connected. Everyone is expressing themselves. Very few are actually revealing themselves. Personas talk to personas. Meanwhile, the real self stays buried underneath all that adaptation. When the mask becomes the identity, Jung understood that the persona turns genuinely dangerous the moment a person mistakes it for their real identity, because then every criticism feels like psychological death. Every dip in status feels unbearable. So people protect the mask at almost any cost, suppressing parts of themselves to stay accepted. hiding emotion to stay respected, performing confidence to dodge humiliation. Over time, the performance becomes automatic, which is part of why some people seem to break down years later for no obvious reason. Their souls simply got exhausted from carrying an identity built for survival instead of truth. The unsettling thing about real self-awareness is that it slowly dissolves the emotional anesthesia you used to live under. You stop romanticizing people so easily. You stop confusing charm with character. And maybe most painfully, you stop casting yourself as the innocent party in every story, because shadow work always turns inward eventually. You start noticing your own manipulations, your own hunger for validation, your own quiet wish to be chosen, admired, rescued. The mind loves spotting darkness in other people while staying conveniently blind to its own. The shadow hides motive underneath morality, and once you start noticing your own unconscious patterns, you understand why Jung believed self-knowledge was both a form of liberation and a burden. You start realizing that part of your suffering came not just from what others did to you, but from what you kept allowing. You ignored red flags because loneliness made attention feel valuable. You kept overextending yourself because being needed temporarily protected you from feeling empty. Awareness strips the emotional glamour off all of it. Suddenly your past doesn't look tragic anymore, it just looks predictable. Once you understand that, the whole social world rearranges itself in your head. You stop asking who loves me and start asking who needs me to remain a certain version of myself. Some friendships survive only as long as you stay smaller than your potential. Some relationships survive only as long as you remain emotionally predictable. The moment you change, tension shows up, not because growth is wrong, but because growth disrupts a psychological equilibrium other people had quietly built around your old identity. Suddenly, the reliable one starts pulling back. The giver stops overextending. The people pleaser develops boundaries, and boundaries reveal truth faster than any argument ever could. Because the moment access becomes limited, any hidden sense of entitlement surfaces almost instantly. Some people never loved your soul. They loved their access to you. That realization hardens something inside a person, not cruelly, more like a clean, surgical clarity. You start separating real connection from emotional dependency. You stop measuring love by intensity alone, because intensity can exist without any real depth. Some of the most intense relationships are built entirely out of unresolved trauma, colliding two wounded people unconsciously trying to complete their own fractures through each other. One craves reassurance, the other craves control. Together they call the resulting chaos love, until the unconscious eventually turns the relationship into a battlefield. The shadow speaks a different language. Jung understood that whatever stays unconscious controls behavior from underneath awareness. That's why people sabotage things they consciously want. Why they repeat painful cycles while promising themselves they'll change. The conscious mind speaks one language, the shadow speaks another, and the shadow is patient, waiting underneath every attraction, every insecurity, every irrational reaction. A delayed text suddenly feels personal, a shift in tone feels threatening, distance triggers panic, success triggers guilt, rejection triggers rage. People assume these reactions come from the present moment, when most of the time they're surfacing from accumulated history buried underneath it. And the dangerous part is that most people never examine their reactions closely enough to understand them. So they project instead, blaming fate, relationships, bad luck, betrayal, society, anything except the unconscious patterns quietly steering their own behavior. Because facing the shadow means admitting something genuinely uncomfortable. You are not entirely who you think you are. Part of you is built from adaptation, part from fear, part from suppressed resentment, part from unmet needs wearing the costume of personality. Even ambition can be compensation. Some people chase success not because they love achieving things, but because they believe status will finally make them worthy of love. And no amount of external success can permanently fill an internal wound, which is why some people get everything they wanted and still feel strangely empty afterward. The goal was never the goal. It was an escape route. Eventually, the realization becomes impossible to dodge. Nobody is coming to save you from yourself. Not love, not success, not admiration, not money. The deepest forms of suffering are internal structures, and external rewards can distract from them, but rarely dissolve them. That's why some people quietly sabotage healthy relationships right after finally receiving real love, why others wreck opportunities they spent years praying for, why peace itself can start to feel uncomfortable to a nervous system trained on chaos. The unconscious keeps trying to return to whatever feels psychologically familiar, even when that familiarity hurts, especially when it hurts. This is the part most people resist hearing. Healing isn't becoming happier. Healing is becoming conscious, and consciousness is uncomfortable, because it removes the fantasy that life will eventually transform on its own. It forces you to look at the mechanics underneath your own behavior with brutal clarity. You start noticing how often fear has been disguising itself as personality. I'm independent. Or maybe you became self-contained because trust once humiliated you. I don't need anyone, or maybe needing people once made you feel powerless. The ego builds narratives to protect itself from painful truths, and society rewards a lot of those narratives because wounded productivity still benefits everyone around you. Someone who overworks out of inner emptiness gets praised for their drive. Someone who suppresses emotion gets called mature. But admiration doesn't heal fragmentation, it often deepens it, because the more reward a mask receives, the harder it becomes to take off. This is why a lot of people quietly fear solitude. Solitude removes distraction, and distraction is essentially modern anesthesia. Without the noise, the psyche starts surfacing whatever's been buried. Regret, envy, shame, dependency, loneliness, a fear of insignificance, all the things people spend years outrunning through stimulation, relationships, entertainment, or constant motion. But life eventually corners almost everyone into stillness, through loss, failure, isolation, or exhaustion. And in that stillness, a hard truth becomes difficult to avoid. You've been waiting for permission to become who you already needed to be. Stronger boundaries, greater self-respect, emotional discipline, responsibility for your own mind. Nobody was ever coming to hand those things to you. That can sound depressing at first, until a second realization shows up right behind it. If nobody is coming, then nobody is stopping you either. No savior is arriving, but no jailer is actually holding the keys. Most psychological prisons get built on the inside long before they show up anywhere in the real world. Fear of rejection, of abandonment, of failure, of being misunderstood. Invisible chains, quietly running human behavior every day. People stay silent to avoid conflict, stay small to avoid envy, stay agreeable to avoid loneliness. Entire personalities, engineered around unconscious survival strategies. Society rarely rewards authenticity right away. It rewards predictability, compliance, emotional convenience. That's why authentic people so often feel isolated while they're transforming. They've simply stopped playing unconscious games everyone else still mistakes for ordinary life. And once you fully see those games, you can't unsee them. A quieter kind of stability. After that, life gets strangely quiet, not on the outside, but underneath. The endless psychological bargaining starts to fade. You stop negotiating your worth through usefulness. You stop chasing reassurance from emotionally inconsistent people. You stop trying to decode mixed signals from anyone who benefits from keeping you uncertain, because uncertainty itself is a form of power. Whoever controls the emotional clarity in a dynamic usually controls it. That's why some people dish out affection inconsistently, why they get warm the second you pull back and distant the second you return. Intermittent reinforcement creates obsession far more efficiently than steady attention ever could. Casinos understand this, social media understands this, and plenty of people understand it instinctively too. The human mind tends to value whatever feels hard to secure, which is why so many spend years chasing emotional experiences that quietly destabilize them, mistaking anxiety for passion and unpredictability for depth. Eventually, awareness interrupts the addiction. You start seeing emotional chaos for what it actually is. A nervous system out hunting for familiar suffering. That changes the way you love, not colder, just cleaner. You stop trying to rescue people committed to drowning in their own patterns. You stop believing potential outweighs behavior. You stop romanticizing pain just because it feels intense, because intensity isn't transformation, and suffering doesn't automatically produce wisdom. Sometimes it just produces repetition. There are people who've suffered for decades and learned nothing from it except how to pass that suffering along to everyone around them. Pain can either deepen consciousness or deepen bitterness, and the difference between the two is awareness. Awareness, in turn, demands something difficult from every person. Responsibility not for everything that happened to you, but for what continues to move through you. That distinction quietly changes lives, because a lot of people unconsciously turn into extensions of the very wounds they claim to hate. Betrayed people become so guarded they create loneliness around themselves. Neglected people become addicted to validation. The shadow reproduces itself through unconscious behavior, and most people never interrupt the cycle, because blaming others always feels safer than confronting their own patterns. But the moment you genuinely stop waiting for rescue, something starts to shift. You become harder to emotionally negotiate with. You stop collapsing every time someone withdraws their approval. You stop panicking when you're misunderstood. A different kind of stability emerges, not the fragile confidence built on praise, but a quieter one, built from the experience of surviving your own mind. Because eventually you realize that some of the darkest nights of your life were never fully witnessed by anyone else. No audience saw the internal battles. And yet you survived them alone. That realization carries a strange kind of power, not ego. Evidence that you're more psychologically resilient than the frightened version of yourself once believed. And resilience changes a person. Whoever truly understands abandonment tends to stop romanticizing permanence in other people. They learn to appreciate connection without worshipping it, to love without psychologically collapsing into it, because they finally accept something most people spend years resisting. Everything human is temporary. Attention fades. Roles change. People evolve. And underneath all of it, life keeps moving with a kind of indifference that's almost frightening. That indifference is what breaks some people and frees others. Because once you stop expecting life to shield you from pain, betrayal, loneliness, or uncertainty, you stop living in constant negotiation with reality. You start seeing existence more clearly. No hidden guarantees, no permanent emotional safety, no final moment where fear disappears for good. Just consciousness, moving through temporary experiences, trying to make meaning while surrounded by impermanence. At first that feels cold. Then, strangely, it starts to feel liberating. Because if nothing was ever guaranteed, the exhausting performance of pretending becomes unnecessary. You no longer need to wear yourself out chasing perfection. You no longer need universal approval before you're allowed to trust your own judgment. Most people fear abandonment because they never built an identity that exists outside of attachment. But once you survive enough psychological loss, you discover the self can exist independently of who stays. Rejection stops feeling like annihilation. Loneliness stops feeling like proof of worthlessness. You start to understand that most human suffering comes not from reality itself, but from resisting it. Resisting endings, resisting change, resisting clear sight of other people, and most of all, resisting clear sight of yourself, because the truth dismantles a lot of comforting illusions. And illusions are addictive. The illusion that everyone who says I care truly does. That effort guarantees reciprocity, that someone, eventually, will arrive and quietly repair the emptiness inside you. But nobody can permanently repair what you refuse to face yourself. That's the shadow's final lesson. The parts of yourself you avoid don't disappear, they wait, quietly steering your choices, fears, attractions, and ambitions from underneath your awareness. Ignored loneliness becomes dependency. Ignored insecurity becomes arrogance. Ignored pain becomes cruelty. The unconscious always finds a way to express itself, which means the real danger was never darkness itself, it was unconscious darkness. If there's a version of this, you can actually live by something less abstract than shadows and personas. It's something closer to this. Stop auditioning for love that requires you to disappear a little more every year to keep it. The people who only wanted access to a convenient version of you were never actually choosing you, and grieving that is allowed. But on the other side of that grief is something most people never get to. The strange, sturdy relief of not needing anyone's footsteps outside the door to feel like your life is finally allowed to start. You don't have to become hardened to get there. You can still help people, still love hard, still stay loyal, just without the quiet, unspoken bill you used to attach to it. The difference is that you're no longer doing it from a place of waiting. You're doing it because it's who you actually want to be, with or without an audience, with or without anyone noticing, with or without the rescue you spent years half expecting. That's not resignation. It's closer to the opposite. It's the moment you stop standing at the window checking for someone and finally turn around to look at the room you've actually been living in the whole time your own. And once you see that room clearly, furnished by your own choices instead of borrowed approval, you tend to find it's far more livable than you ever gave it credit for. Nobody was coming. As it turns out, nobody had to. You were already there. Now, I'd like to share a meaningful story with everyone. The toughest age. When your daughter turns 9, you will see a child, peach fuzz on her legs, and a curveless silhouette. You will see a spray of freckles dotting her unblemished skin, the glint of copper when the sun catches her hair. When your daughter turns 9, you will hear her giggle as she runs through the yard. Hear the gentle thud of her body hitting the grass as she tries to cartwheel, her whoop of joy when she nails it, the slam of the screen door as she runs in and out, in and out. When your daughter turns 9, she will stun you daily with how young 9 is, what 9 is, stuffed animals, long division, chapter books, not the white-hot poker of your 9. When your daughter turns 9, you will look at every boy, every man with smoldering suspicion. You will reject sleepover requests from all but the most trusted of her friends. Build a firewall around her childish ways. When your daughter turns 9, she will not be afraid to undress for a bath. She will not ask for a lock on her bedroom door. She will not wet her pants when someone startles her. She will remain her chatty self, unconcerned what secrets might escape her lips. When your daughter turns 9, you will time travel 30 years. reunited with your sizzling flesh. You will fail to maintain the pretense that 9 never happened. Stutter when a therapist asks when your brother started touching you. Taste the tang of bile when you answer. You will be unable to look directly at your daughter's 9ness, blinded by the gulf between what could have been and what was, grimy hands encircling your wrists, light bouncing off stainless steel scissors you swung in vain. You will think you cannot survive this age twice, but instead, you will close your eyes and lean in, chauffeur her to school and games and birthday parties. Clap until your hands are raw when she flips across the bouncy gymnastics mat. Squeeze her extra tight as you tuck her in each night. Gather the embers of your charred 9 and reshape them into fuel until her 9 is done. Get her to 10 unscathed, and panic will stop clawing at your throat. 10, like every year after, doesn't live in your body. 10's flames don't lick your skin. By 10, you were already gone. Dear viewers, that was our channel's discussion on the topic. The empath is about to enter the biggest comeback of their life. Jung insight. If you found this video helpful or meaningful, please consider subscribing to support the channel. If you'd like me to create more content about emotions, relationships, or other psychological topics, feel free to leave a comment and let me know. I'll do my best to help you understand why you're feeling the way you do and what's really happening beneath the surface. For now, it's time to say goodbye. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video. Thank you.